We're glad you're here today. We're going to continue our discussion of the case for the Bible in the postmodern world. This passage that we referred to last week in Colossians comes from Paul writing to a group of people who were being inundated by different people from different sides, telling them that Christ was not sufficient, that Christianity was lacking. And so Paul wrote to them in chapter 2, verse 4 of this letter, and he said, "Be careful that no one deludes you with fine-sounding arguments." In verse 8 here, he says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, according to the elementary principles of the world." Last week, we talked about the fact that philosophy is simply a term for how do we develop our worldview? How do people come to see the world as they do? Most people don't go out and study philosophy. They simply absorb a worldview from the people and information around them, from their culture, And so postmodernism, which we're talking about in this class, is a predominant Western worldview that we have right now. And according to postmodern philosophy, the postmoderns are very skeptical of any kind of authority, very skeptical of any statement that is supposed to be absolutely true, very skeptical of people who claim to be showing history because they're afraid it's not presented accurately, skeptical of government, skeptical of any kind of authority. And when this translates down to how we deal with the Bible and Christianity, postmoderns view the Bible differently because, they're skeptical of authority and they're skeptical of truth, and they see the Bible as something different than we see it. So if we're having a discussion with somebody who may not even realize it, but they've adopted this philosophy of looking at the world, and we're quoting Bible verses at them, that may not be having the effect that we wish it would, because they may look at the Bible in a completely different way than we do, as a very human book that only reflects the culture that it came from and not something that is authoritative in any way, shape, or form. So we talked through these things last week, but very briefly, when we look at the Bible and take it at face value, or if we're talking to people that have this view, if we take it literally for what it says, okay? It says, if you look at the whole library of 66 books, that this is a library of ancient documents which claim to reveal two things. Number one, a series of events. We're going to talk about that today. Things that happened in the real world, in which God intervened in history. Now, see that second part. I say, well, how would you prove that God intervened in these actions, that these things really happened and that it was God doing these things, okay? But that's what the Bible says. And that based on these God things that happened in history, there is a divinely revealed God, a guide or ideology for human life. And this divinely revealed guide for human life and conduct is supposedly superior to other ideas about life and human conduct. Okay? Now, postmodern philosophy that is just by osmosis from the internet and from YouTube and from family and friends and from academia and from all these different places, it's in people. It has caused them to look at the Bible this way instead of the way we look at the Bible. The Bible, they would say, is a collection of ancient books, true, but it's simply a record of the cultural mythology and the cultural moral codes of Jewish and early Christian people. So we've got an ancient group of people, the Hebrews, and they have a cultural mythology that goes back to ancient times, like other cultures have cultural mythologies. And these stories that you read in the Bible would be the mythology of their culture. That's the way they look at it. Not that the stuff actually happened, see, but that it's cultural mythology. And the moral codes that the Bible presents are simply the cultural consensus moral codes of a group of people from a certain period of time. That's all, nothing more, nothing less, just like the cultural moral codes of other groups of people that we see manifested in other literatures around the world, okay? Now, some of you moderns, which are not part of the postmodern world, are looking at me like, have you lost your mind? See, but those in here that are postmoderns, and they're not looking at me that way at all. They fully get that they and some of them struggle and their friends, and that this is the mindset that people hold, okay? So this is what I'm trying to say. We have an impasse here many times in our efforts to communicate with one another in productive ways, because we don't realize that the people we're talking to see things in a completely different way than we do, okay? And so this conversation we're having in this class is an attempt to help us not only work through our own faith, but to communicate with others. Now, going along with this, there is a movement in our country called the deconstruction, I'll get it in a minute, the deconstruction movement. Deconstruction happens in other fields, but particularly deconstructive theology, where Christian people who have been affected by postmodern philosophy are in a process of deconstructing the things that they once believed in. They're going through a process of, I don't believe that anymore because it doesn't make sense because, and they're getting rid of one and then another aspect of Christianity, oftentimes to not identify as Christians at all anymore, okay? And so realizing that that's going on wholesale all over the place, our attempt here in this class is to, address some of the kinds of questions that these people would be asking. And we may be having conversation and not even realize that these questions are on their mind, and they might not feel comfortable bringing up these questions because they might feel afraid that we're going to bite their head off if they bring up these kinds of questions, okay? And maybe they're right, and that's a shame, because if that's the case, we're not going to have any good conversations. We're not going to have understanding for one another so that we can communicate. Okay, so look at this again. This is the postmodern view of the Bible. And in contrast with that, again, this is the biblical view that is, if you take the Bible literally, the Bible teaches that divine entrance into human history, God intervened in human history and did stuff, resulted in an ideology for human existence which transcends all others. Okay, well, they'd say, well, you're going to have to prove that. So let's deal today. We're finally getting into what we're going to discuss today. Today, we're going to talk about the fact that the Bible states clearly that certain things happened. They actually happened in the world, okay? And along with that, it states that God was involved in those events. God caused those events. God was working in those events. All right, well, you say, duh, I've always believed that. Well, I understand that. Some have, some haven't. See, and if you take that as a given, you're starting at a place where a lot of people around us are not starting. See, you're assuming things that they don't assume. And so we're going to try to start in a different place. All right, so postmodernism says there is no objective reality. And what that means is that reality, in their view, does not exist outside of some kind of a person's assessment. So if a person who is subjective, we're all a bit subjective, right? If a person who is subjective is examining something, there's going to be a certain amount of subjectivity to their assessment. So what they're saying is that all reality is seen as reality through fallible people, and those people are subjective in their assessments, and so there's really no objective truth. Okay? Part two here, which is very similar, they say that there's no objective scientific or historical truth. They'll point out that some things that science has discovered, you keep studying for a number of years and it's overturned, and they learn better and they learn a little more refined how it really is and so forth. And so the first assessment was not completely true, you know. And so also in history is notoriously biased in the way it's reported, right? People have their own bents and biases about how they go and report history. And so they're saying that there's no objective historical truth. All right? But do events, think about this, do events in the world take place in and of themselves regardless of those that observe them? I mean, you know, if you take an earthquake that happened last year in a particular location, was there in fact an earthquake? Did that event take place regardless of the people that reported on it or whatever? Did it take place? You see what I'm saying? So there is some objectivity there. And also we might point out that the statement number one is itself an absolute statement. To say that there is no objective reality is an absolute in itself, okay? So it's absolutely an absolute that says that there's no absolutes. You see what I'm saying? And if you'd taken a philosophy course somewhere, you'd be right with me. But anyway, their key word in this is objective, because they're talking about being filtered through people. Now, let's think about these possibilities. So if we look at things in the Bible, let's take some events in the Bible. We've got the event of creation. In the very first verse, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay? So, A, it happened. B, well, it never really happened. And then C, which we're going to come to with some of our own theologians, does it really matter if it happened or didn't happen? You say, what do you mean, does it really matter? Well, but in this conversation we're having, that is a question. Say, did it happened? It never happened? Does it matter or not whether it ever happened? Now, some of our own supposed theologians from Churches of Christ wrote a book several years ago. I tried to talk to y'all about it, and y'all were like, what the world are you talking about this book? Well, this book is exactly what we're talking about here, postmodernism getting into theology. So these three brothers that wrote this book were talking in this page, this is page 100 of this book, and they were talking about the Exodus from Egypt, you know, the fact that God redeemed Israel from Egypt and took them out of slavery and everything. And so they began asking questions in the context of this paragraph about, you know, did this really happen? Did this really happen like the Bible says? Did this really happen? Did this really happen? And then they have this paragraph. What is crucial for the church today is not the data of the raw history. See, whether it happened is not crucial. But the meaning of the story of the Exodus that Jews and Christians repeated over and over again to their children. So what they're telling us, Gene, is it's a wonderful story. It's a great story, like some of the great stories of fiction and Western literature and everything, but we shouldn't get hung up in whether it actually happened or not. Now, these are Bible professors at one of our universities, supposedly, training our preachers with a postmodern theological worldview, see? And it's something that it's all over the place. And most of us keep our heads deep into the sand and we don't necessarily realize that this is happening, okay? But say we back up to this. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Does it matter? whether it happened. Let me tell you, folks, it matters whether it happened or not. Big time. Big time. All right. So let's look at this passage. This is Exodus chapter 12. And this is Exodus 12, starting at verse 29. This is a biblical passage that deals with the Exodus from Egypt and, all the plagues that God brought against Egypt and all this stuff. Let's just dissect this for a minute. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. Now, notice how terse that statement is. Subject, the Lord, Yahweh, struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. Okay, so now let's back up. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Does it matter? Okay. So first thing that says happened, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. Secondly, verse 30, Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night. That sounds like something that happened. And there was loud wailing in Egypt. There were people, can you imagine your neighborhood, every single house in your neighborhood? You are in your neighborhood, wherever you live around Paducah, and sometimes there's a wreath on the door and you realize there's been a death in your neighborhood. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know that it was that serious and there was a death over there in that house. What if every single house in Paducah, with a few exceptions, had a death all at the same time, and there was loud crying and wailing everywhere? So that's what's being described here. There was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. See, the Israelites were in the land of Goshen, separate from the rest of them. Then you keep reading down at verse 35. The Israelites did as Moses instructed, and he instructed them to take stuff from the Egyptians. And they asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing, so they plundered the Egyptians. Now, did they or didn't they? The Bible says they did. Okay. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Now, the way this is written, it's quite terse, and it just says this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it gives a number and says there were this many people, and it gives you locations and said they traveled from this location to that location. Now, this is not like, far, far away in a far off galaxy. This is on the map locations, because if we look at the Egyptian Delta and we look at the places that are mentioned in the book of Exodus, this last passage says they journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. Well, there you have it right there, where those actual places are, see, when they left slavery and they began to travel out in the wilderness toward the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, and place, number 600,000 approximately. That almost sounds like a historical record, doesn't it? Now, I don't know how many of you have read ancient Near Eastern texts very much, but I've got a thick book that's a standard book. It's edited by Pritchard, and this book is nothing but translations of Babylonian and Egyptian and Ugaritic and Sumerian texts from the ancient times that are translated from their language into English. And if you read through those texts are like names of gods who are killing each other, and the river flowed out of this woman's belly, and I mean, if you read these texts, they're not at all in any way, shape, or form like the biblical text. They're nothing like the biblical text, see? And so when you read something like Genesis or Exodus in contrast with these ancient texts, you say, whoa, there's a world of difference between these texts, okay? So at least we have the account of Exodus grounded on the map, And, let's talk for a minute about archaeology, because we're going to get into archaeology a little bit. Some people will say, but there's no clear archaeological record of Israel leaving in the Exodus from Egypt. Okay? True. However, let's just talk about archaeology as evidence for a minute. Out of all of the houses in McCracken County, how many houses in McCracken County go back to the 1800s in the time that they were built? What percentage of houses in McCracken County go back to the 1800s? What would you guess? Barry guesses maybe 1%. That's probably high, but yeah, okay. Let's ask that question again. How many houses in the United States go back to the 1600s? Actual houses in the United States, percentage-wise, that go back to the 1600s. I think it'd be way less than 1%. It'd be point something, 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 something. Okay, now let's go back further. If we went over to Europe, if we went to, like we went to England one time and we went to this house that was built in the 1200s. But out of all the homes in England, there might be one or two places that were built in the 1200s. Okay, right? Now, they've dug around in tells in England, and they've gotten some artifacts, few and far between, that come from the Celtic times and everything like that, with a few little inscriptions on it. But they tell us almost nothing about what happened at that point. Now then, let's extrapolate that backwards to 1,450 years before Christ. How much of ancient buildings and etc. actually remains in the world from the time of 1,450 years before Christ? It's infinitesimally, I can't say that word, Zach, small. It's really small. Okay? So archaeology is lacking most of the information of history. And if we look at what we do have from a few Egyptian tombs and some things that we have, and from an Egyptian priest from actually the 3rd century BC instead of 1,400 years BC, they speak of a people in the 1500s BC and a little bit after called the Hyksos people. The Hyksos were people that lived in the Nile Delta. In the Nile Delta, the Hyksos speak of people from the West Semitics. West Semitics would be people from the land of Canaan and Syria, that would include the Israelites, that there were many of those in the Nile Delta, and they were both, there were some that were rulers from that area, some, many of them that were slaves or workers from that area. It doesn't call them Israelites. It just puts them all in one basket and calls them West Semites, West Semites. And it does speak of a time when hundreds of thousands of them left Egypt and went elsewhere. But whether that's exactly identified with the Israelite Exodus or not, we're not sure. See, because it's ambiguous. The information is ambiguous. All right? And it's very small, the information that we have. However, if you look at Exodus chapter 5, you all remember the story of when Moses went and said, "Let my people go." And then Pharaoh said, "Well, we're going to stop that nonsense." And he changed the way they were making bricks and didn't give them the straw to make the bricks and everything. And here we have some ancient Egyptian artifacts that show the slaves making the bricks and the process of the slaves making the bricks as they worked on these cities that they built, like Ramses and other cities. See? Were some of these slaves Israelite slaves? Probably so. But this kind of thing is all over the place in Egypt, see? Which is the same kind of thing we have described in the book of Exodus. In Exodus 14, it describes the armies of Egypt going after the Israelites, after second thoughts, as they left Egypt. Here we have a model from Siut of an Egyptian company. These are 4 lines of 10 soldiers each, 40 in a company. These kinds of Egyptian soldiers were the kinds that were in the time that the Bible speaks about. You can imagine them and Pharaoh and his commanders and the chariots. This is Tutankhamun, or this is Tutankhamun right here. But other pharaohs similar. And, going after the children of Israel and talking about the chariots and horses and all those things going down in the sea. We don't have an exact record that says, the Israelites left at this date and this is what happened to the army, but there's a lot of similarities. What about the gods of Egypt at that time and the plagues? What about the plague of turning the river into blood, the Nile into blood? One of their major gods was the god of the Nile. And one of the plagues was turning the water into blood. By the way, the Hyksos material, it talks about the god of the West Semites bringing great storms during the dry season and diseases that were upon the people. The God that they call El Elyon, or God Most High. Now, you can't prove that that's the biblical account, but it's certainly interesting. Mr. Moss, what you say? I'm glad you pointed that out. So for those of you that couldn't hear him, especially for those of you online, he pointed out that the propensity of the Egyptians in writing their history on tombs was to leave out the bad stuff or reframe it so that it sound better. And if they lost a battle, to make it sound like they actually won the battle and do things like that. Absolutely. Absolutely. But what I'm telling you, and along with what Mr. Moss, who teaches this history, is telling you, is that there are many lacunae, which means there's a lot of holes. Most of archaeology is not there, and it doesn't tell us everything that happened. But in the things that we do have in antiquity, there's a lot of ambiguity. So just when somebody tells you ambiguity, when somebody tells you that there's no record of this, that means very little to me. Because there are some records that might be talking about some of this. And for most things that happened back there, there are no records. However, a lot of this stuff about the Hyksos comes from an Egyptian priest that's actually in the 3rd century BC that's writing about what happened in 1400 BC. But our biblical documents are much older than that. See? And our biblical documents are of a different character, and they just say this happened, and then this happened, and there were so many of these people, and they journeyed from point A to point B, and there's a great deal of evidence for these things. You remember the disease that came upon the cattle of Egypt. Here you have the Egyptian cow goddess, and you have Apis, the bull god of the Egyptians. You remember the Israelites making the bull calf because they were familiar with these things. Well, the plague was against the cattle that struck out at these Egyptian gods, There's Ra, the sun god. And you remember that, some of the pharaohs even had Ra at the end of their name. But you remember the plague of darkness. That was showing God's power over the sun god, And you have Osiris, the god of the underworld, the god of death. But then God swept all these Egyptians off the board, the firstborn of every family, and so showing his power over the Egyptian gods, the way the Old Testament puts this. So while we don't have a blow-by-blow record in ancient Egyptian records, which are, by the way, they're very, very sparse, those ancient records. They don't tell us almost anything about ancient Egyptian history. But though we don't have a blow-by-blow record of all that, there are many touch points, and the biblical narrative seems grounded in the right places and the right customs and the right things that happened at that time. And so there's every reason to believe that the biblical narrative is about something that happened. Let me ask you to consider this as well, and then I'm going to shut up and let y'all ask some more questions. The Bible itself bases a whole lot on the Exodus. Y'all have read the 10 Commandments, right? Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And everybody, but notice how the 10 Commandments are bolstered as legit in this passage. The passage starts out, I am Yahweh, your God, who did what? Who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. See, the event and the power of the event and the drama of the event is what the authority of God is based on in this passage. If the event didn't happen, this makes no sense whatsoever. See, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Next verse, you shall have no other gods before me. Well, didn't God just prove his superiority over all the other gods? You shall not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything in the heaven above, in the earth beneath, and the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down yourself to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. See, all of this is based on the events. So, we go back up here. This is just one case in point that we're talking about here. See, here are our choices. Well, it happened. And the fact that it happened explains everything that comes after it. Or we can say, well, it never happened. But then when we ask the question, does it matter if it happened? Absolutely it matters if it happened. If it didn't happen, nothing else in the whole Old Testament makes any sense. Jesus referred to the Exodus as an event that happened. So if, Jesus was deluded if it didn't happen. So it does matter whether it happened. Now, I know these guys, popular in some circles of churches of Christ, say it doesn't matter if it happened. It's just a wonderful story. And if you accept that, then if the Bible is just cultural mythology and it's cultural mores that came out of that culture, then it doesn't really matter if I really follow the teachings of the Bible exactly or not. It doesn't matter a bit. I can reframe my faith and reframe my beliefs and believe whatever I want to, if that's the case. And that's exactly what's going on all around us today, with theological approval from many of their teachers. That's part of the problem as well. All right. Questions? Questions? Okay, this was just one case in point. Let's look real quickly at a couple of other things that the Bible lists as events. John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. It starts out in this chapter saying, in the beginning was the Word, or the Logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And then verse 14 says, and the Word, the Logos, became flesh and lived for a while among us. Well, that is the incarnation of Christ. That's an event. All right, let's go back to our three choices. It never happened. It happened. Does it matter whether it happened or it didn't happen? Okay? But, you get to discussing this. Does it really matter if I believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? Does it matter if he was just born regularly like anybody else was born? Yes. Yes, it matters. Just like the Exodus mattered. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Does it make a difference whether it happened or not? It makes all kinds of difference. See, people who want to do it Burger King style in religion, have it your way, have it your way. Hold the pickles, hold the lettuce, nothing you say will upset us. If you want religion that way, then the postmodern ideology is exactly right for you. Okay? But biblical religion is something different. All right, so look at this statement of Paul. Paul says, what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, watch it now, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared unto Cephas and then to the 12, and then he appeared to above 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, and then to the rest of the disciples, and afterwards, as unto a child untimely born, he appeared to me also, says Paul. Okay? But that is a big one. Was Jesus bodily raised up from the dead? Well, the Bible says he was. Okay, it happened. It didn't happen. Does it make any difference? Well, yes, because he said, I'm going to come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may also be. So it really, really matters whether it happened. All through the Bible, there are events that are said to be perpetrated by God in human history. And, that's what we're talking about. Now, the postmodern view of reality is not new, but parts of it are not new. Old liberal theology did this in the 1800s and early 1900s to the Bible. They picked up the scientific method as the only way to know anything, and they decided that they needed to strip the Bible of all of its mythology. Rudolf Bultmann, who was a famous German theologian, called this demythologizing the text. So he would go through the biblical text and take out all the supernatural stuff that he would say couldn't possibly have happened because it's supernatural. We know stuff like that doesn't happen. You can't scientifically verify it. And during this milieu, Albert Schweitzer wrote this book. And the book is called The Quest of the Historical Jesus. In other words, trying to figure out what the Jesus was like that really lived, not the Jesus that we read about in the Bible, who is like a superhero and did all these miracles and stuff. So Schweitzer says in his book, the Jesus of Nazareth, who came forth publicly as the Messiah, who preached the ethic of the kingdom of God, who founded the kingdom of heaven on earth and died to give his work final consecration, never had any existence. See, he's saying that the biblical Jesus never lived. There was maybe a guy that was named Jesus that lived, but not the biblical Jesus. And then he says, just like our brothers in that book, God's Holy Fire, but the truth is that it is not Jesus as historically known, but Jesus as he is spiritually arisen among men. In other words, the Jesus you feel in your heart, whether he's real or not, doesn't make any difference. See? He is significant for our time and can help it. Not the historical Jesus, in other words, the one that really lived, but the Spirit that goes forth from him is that which overcomes the world. Now, notice how similar that statement from Albert Schweitzer is to this statement written by our brothers that says what is crucial for the church today is not the raw data of the history of the Exodus and subsequent events, but the meaning of the story of the Exodus that Jews and Christians repeated over and over again. See, it's just a story. Yes, Brother Brandon? Yeah, the Bible speaks of creation in 7 days. Some say the days are epochs. Some say the days are 24-hour days. They're trying to marry Darwinism with biblical creation. And the harder you try to marry Darwinism with biblical creation, the more difficulty you have. I don't think that's a proper thing to do. You either believe in biblical creation or you don't. But, I mean, let's put it this way. What's the difference between believing in biblical creation and believing in the plagues of Egypt, or passing through the Red Sea on dry ground, or the virgin birth, or the resurrection of Jesus, or the miracles of Jesus? You know, what's the difference? There's not any difference. And a whole nother discussion with Darwinism, but we'll have to pick that up next time. But Darwinism is based on Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. Natural selection means there's no help from outside, you know, it's just nature. But Darwin's experiments that led him to that were on finches that he was messing with, and Darwin, was breeding certain finches to certain other finches. He was engineering the process, see, and he was saying, I can get different wing color and beak color and everything by marrying all these things. So his selection was not natural. It was engineered by an engineer his name was Darwin, see. And from breeding finches himself, he came up with this idea that all this naturally involved with no outside help. But natural selection, I'll let you go. But in Darwin's book, he speaks of nature as a person. Nature does this and nature does that. But when I'm reading Darwin with somebody in my office, I say, nature doesn't do anything. He's acting like nature's a person engineering things. Anyway, I'll see you later and we'll talk next week, Lord willing.